Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the harsh realities that came with being a medieval court jester. The life of a medieval court jester was far from the merry existence that popular imagination might suggest, and to truly understand the harsh realities of this profession, we must peer beyond the jingling bells and colorful motley to see the complex web of dangers, humiliations, and precarious circumstances that define their daily existence. While modern portrayals often paint jesters as beloved entertainers who lived lives of relative comfort and freedom, the historical truth reveals a profession fraught with peril, where a single misjudged joke could mean the difference between a hearty laugh and a swift execution, where the very skills that made them valuable also made them expendable, and where their position in society was simultaneously elevated and utterly vulnerable. Picture, if you will, waking each morning not to the gentle sounds of birds or the comforting routine of honest labor, but to the gnawing anxiety of knowing that your survival depends entirely upon your ability to amuse people who hold absolute power over life and death. The medieval court jester existed in a strange twilight realm between servant and confidant, between fool and philosopher, and this ambiguous status brought with it a unique set of challenges that would test even the most resilient of souls. They were expected to be witty without being threatening, clever without being subversive, and entertaining without crossing invisible lines that shifted like sand beneath their feet with each passing mood of their royal employers. The physical demands of the profession alone were enough to break many who attempted it, for jesters were expected to be acrobats, musicians, storytellers, comedians, and performers, all rolled into one exhausting package. Their bodies bore the constant strain of tumbling, juggling, dancing, and contorting into positions that would make modern circus performers wince with sympathy. Imagine spending your days throwing yourself about stone floors for the amusement of others, your knees and elbows constantly bruised from pratfalls, your back aching from the endless bowing and scraping that court etiquette demanded, even from those whose job it was to mock that very same etiquette. The bells sewn into their clothing, while iconic, were not merely decorative, but served as a constant auditory reminder of their status as objects of entertainment, rather than individuals deserving of basic human dignity. But the physical toll was perhaps the least of their worries, for the psychological pressures of court life could drive even the most stable minds toward madness. Jesters lived under the constant scrutiny of nobles who viewed them as exotic pets, amusing curiosities to be displayed for visiting dignitaries and foreign ambassadors. They were expected to be perpetually cheerful, eternally ready with a quip or jest, regardless of their personal circumstances or emotional state. A jester who appeared melancholy or failed to perform with sufficient enthusiasm might find themselves replaced with alarming swiftness, cast out from the only life they knew with nothing but their worn motley, and a reputation that would make it difficult to find honest work elsewhere. The precarious nature of their employment meant that jesters could never truly relax or feel secure in their position, no matter how long they had served or how beloved they seemed to be. Royal favor was notoriously fickle, and what amused a king in the morning might anger him by evening, particularly if his mood had been soured by military defeats, political setbacks, or personal disappointments. Jesters learned to read the subtle signs of their master's temperament with the skill of a weather prophet, adjusting their performances accordingly, and always maintaining a mental catalog of safe material for when the political climate grew stormy. The isolation that came with their unique position was perhaps one of the most soul-crushing aspects of jester life, for they existed in a social limbo that prevented them from forming meaningful relationships with either the nobility or the common servants. To the lords and ladies of the court, they were entertaining oddities, never quite human enough to be considered equals or confidants despite the intimate access their position sometimes granted them. To the kitchen staff, stable boys, and other servants, they were viewed with a mixture of envy and suspicion, their relative privileges and proximity to power creating an insurmountable barrier to genuine friendship. This social isolation meant that jesters often went through their entire careers without experiencing the comfort of true companionship, surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone. The economic insecurity of their profession added another layer of stress to their already challenging existence. For unlike craftsmen or merchants who could build wealth through their skills, jesters were entirely dependent upon the whims and generosity of their patrons. They owned nothing but their costumes and props, lived in quarters that could be revoked at any moment, and had no guild or organization to protect their interests or provide support in times of need. A jester who lost favor might find themselves not merely unemployed but destitute, with skills that were difficult to monetize outside the rarefied world of court entertainment. The knowledge that their livelihood hung by such a slender thread created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that permeated every aspect of their lives. The content of their performances presented its own minefield of potential disasters, for jesters were expected to provide commentary on current events, political figures, and social issues, while somehow avoiding giving genuine offense to anyone with the power to harm them. This required a delicate balancing act that would challenge even the most diplomatic of modern politicians, as they needed to appear bold and irreverent enough to be entertaining, while remaining sufficiently harmless to avoid serious consequences. The line between acceptable mockery and dangerous sedition was never clearly drawn, and jesters learned through bitter experience that what might be laughed at when spoken by them could be considered treason if taken too seriously or repeated by the wrong person. Medieval audiences had different sensibilities than modern ones, and humor that might seem cruel or inappropriate by today's standards was not only acceptable but expected, placing jesters in the uncomfortable position of having to mock the disabled, the poor, and other vulnerable groups to satisfy their audience's appetite for entertainment. This requirement to participate in the systematic dehumanization of others for the sake of a few laughs must have taken a toll on the consciences of many jesters, particularly those who came from humble backgrounds themselves and understood the suffering they were being asked to trivialize. Yet refusing to engage in such humor would have been seen as a failure to fulfill their duties, potentially leading to dismissal or worse. The educational requirements of the profession were surprisingly demanding, as successful jesters needed to be well-versed in literature, history, politics, and current events to craft material that would resonate with their sophisticated audiences. This meant spending countless hours studying and memorizing information, learning new songs and stories, and staying current with the latest gossip and political developments. The pressure to constantly generate fresh material was relentless, as audiences quickly grew bored with repeated jokes or outdated references, and a jester who failed to evolve with the times would find their services no longer required. Travel was another significant hardship for many court jesters, as they were often required to accompany their patrons on long journeys to other courts, military campaigns, or diplomatic missions. Medieval travel was uncomfortable, dangerous, and exhausting under the best of circumstances. But jesters faced the additional challenge of having to remain entertaining and upbeat even while suffering from saddle sores, sleeping in drafty tents, and dealing with the constant threat of bandits or enemy forces. They were expected to lift the spirits of their traveling companions regardless of their own discomfort, and any complaints about the hardships of the journey would have been met with little sympathy from nobles who viewed their jesters' suffering as just another form of entertainment. The religious climate of medieval Europe created additional complications for jesters, whose profession was viewed with suspicion by many church authorities who saw humor and levity as potential distractions from proper Christian devotion. Jesters had to navigate carefully around religious topics, avoiding anything that might be construed as blasphemous or irreverent, while still finding ways to entertain audiences that included high-ranking clergy. This religious scrutiny added another layer of potential consequences to their already perilous profession, as accusations of impiety could lead not only to loss of employment, but to serious legal troubles that might result in imprisonment or worse. The lack of legal protections available to jesters made their position even more precarious, as they existed in a legal gray area that offered few safeguards against abuse or exploitation. Unlike other court positions that came with clearly defined rights and responsibilities, jesters served at the complete discretion of their patrons and could be dismissed, punished, or even executed with little recourse or oversight. This legal vulnerability meant that they were entirely dependent upon the goodwill and restraint of their employers, a situation that inevitably led to abuses of power and created an atmosphere of fear that hung over even the most successful jesters like a dark cloud. The physical appearance requirements of the profession often involved humiliating modifications to their natural features, as many jesters were expected to exaggerate their looks through makeup, costumes, or even permanent alterations to create a more amusing or grotesque appearance. Some were required to shave their heads in peculiar patterns, while others had to maintain artificially pale or painted faces that marked them as different from normal society. These visual markers of their profession made it difficult for jesters to blend in or maintain any sense of personal dignity outside their professional roles, essentially branding them as permanent outsiders who could never fully escape their identity as objects of amusement. The competitive nature of court life meant that jesters were constantly vying for attention and favor, not only with other entertainers, but with anyone else who might capture their patron's interest. This created an atmosphere of backstabbing and sabotage that made genuine friendships nearly impossible and forced jesters to view potential allies as threats to their security. The knowledge that their position could be threatened by anyone clever enough to make their patron laugh or think created a paranoid mindset that poisoned their relationships and made it difficult to trust anyone in their immediate environment. Sleep, that basic human need, became another casualty of jester life, as they were often expected to be available at all hours to provide entertainment whenever their patron desired it. Medieval nobles kept irregular schedules and thought nothing of summoning their jesters for impromptu performances in the middle of the night, disrupting any attempt at establishing normal sleep patterns. The chronic exhaustion that resulted from this unpredictable schedule affected their health, their mental clarity, and their ability to perform at their best, creating a vicious cycle where fatigue made them more likely to make mistakes that could have serious consequences. The seasonal nature of medieval court life meant that jesters often faced periods of reduced income or employment during times when their patrons were focused on other activities such as hunting, warfare, or religious observances. These lean periods created additional financial stress and uncertainty, as jesters had to find ways to survive when their primary source of income was unavailable. Some attempted to find temporary work elsewhere, but their distinctive skills and reputation as court entertainers often made it difficult to secure alternative employment, leaving them to rely on whatever savings they had managed to accumulate during better times. Retirement was essentially impossible for most jesters, as their profession offered no pension system or provision for old age, and the physical demands of the job made it difficult to continue performing as they aged. An elderly jester who could no longer tumble, dance, or maintain the energy required for effective entertainment faced the grim prospect of being cast aside with no means of support, their years of service counting for little when they could no longer provide the amusement their patrons demanded. This knowledge of an inevitably impoverished old age cast a shadow over even the most successful jester's career, adding another layer of anxiety to their already stress-filled existence. The medical care available to jesters was often substandard, as they were considered less valuable than other court members, and therefore received less attention when illness or injury struck. The physical demands of their profession made injuries common, but jesters were expected to continue performing even when hurt, often exacerbating minor problems into serious conditions that could end their careers or even their lives. The lack of understanding about mental health in medieval times meant that the psychological toll of their profession went unrecognized and untreated, leaving many jesters to struggle alone with depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues that modern society would recognize as occupational hazards requiring professional intervention. The constant need to maintain their persona, even in private moments, made it difficult for jesters to develop a genuine sense of self, as they spent so much time performing that they often lost touch with their authentic personality and desires. This identity crisis was compounded by the fact that successful jesters often began their careers at a young age, meaning they never had the opportunity to fully develop as individuals outside their professional role. The result was often a deep sense of alienation from their own lives, as they struggled to distinguish between their performing self and their true self, assuming such a distinction still existed after years of constant performance. Family life was nearly impossible for most court jesters, as their unpredictable schedules, constant travel, and social isolation made it difficult to maintain meaningful relationships with spouses or children. Even those who managed to marry often found that their profession created strain in their relationships, as partners struggled to understand the demands of jester life, or grew tired of competing with their spouses' professional obligations for attention and affection. Children of jesters faced their own challenges, as they were often stigmatized by association with their parents' profession, and found it difficult to establish themselves in more respectable occupations. The dietary restrictions and eating habits imposed by their profession created additional health challenges for jesters, who were often expected to eat unusual or unappetizing foods as part of their performance, or to demonstrate their willingness to do anything for a laugh. Some jesters were required to maintain specific body weights or appearances that necessitated unhealthy eating patterns, while others found their meal times constantly interrupted by demands for impromptu performances. The irregular eating schedule and poor nutrition that resulted from these professional requirements took a toll on their physical health and energy levels, making it even more difficult to meet the demanding requirements of their job. The climate of violence and brutality that characterized much of medieval court life meant that jesters were constantly exposed to disturbing sights and experiences that would traumatize modern individuals. Yet they were expected to maintain their cheerful demeanor and continue entertaining even in the aftermath of executions, torture, or other violent spectacles. This exposure to routine violence and cruelty inevitably affected their mental health and worldview, creating a cynical and hardened perspective that made it difficult to find joy in life outside their professional obligations. The technological limitations of medieval times made even basic aspects of jester life more challenging than they would be today, as they lacked access to modern conveniences that could have made their profession more bearable. Simple things like reliable lighting for evening performances, weather-resistant costumes, or effective makeup and stage props were either unavailable or of poor quality, making it more difficult to create the spectacular effects that audiences expected. The lack of recording technology meant that jesters had to rely entirely on their memory to preserve their material, and a moment of forgetfulness during a performance could result in embarrassing mistakes that might damage their reputation. The seasonal depression that affected many people in medieval times was particularly challenging for jesters, who were expected to maintain their entertaining persona regardless of the weather or their personal mood. During the long, dark winters when everyone else was allowed to retreat into quiet contemplation or melancholy, jesters were still required to provide sunshine and laughter, forcing them to suppress their natural emotional responses to the changing seasons. This constant requirement to be on, regardless of circumstances, created additional psychological strain that compounded the other stresses of their profession. The lack of intellectual stimulation available to jesters outside their professional duties was another source of frustration and dissatisfaction, as many were intelligent individuals who craved meaningful conversation and intellectual challenge, but found themselves trapped in roles that required them to suppress their serious thoughts in favor of constant entertainment. The dumbing down of their public persona meant that they rarely had opportunities to engage in the kind of philosophical or political discussions that might have provided relief from the constant pressure to be amusing. The superstitions and folklore surrounding jesters in medieval culture often painted them as unlucky or somehow cursed, creating additional social stigma that made their already difficult lives even more challenging. Some people believed that jesters brought bad luck or were in league with dark forces, leading to ostracism and suspicion that extended beyond the court into their interactions with ordinary citizens. These superstitious beliefs made it even more difficult for jesters to find acceptance or belonging outside their professional roles. The primitive state of medieval medicine meant that the chronic injuries and health problems that resulted from their physically demanding profession often went untreated, or were treated with methods that sometimes made conditions worse rather than better. Jesters who suffered from the cumulative effects of years of physical performance had few options for relief and were expected to continue working despite pain and disability that would be considered grounds for retirement or disability compensation in modern times. The constant need to maintain their persona, even in private moments, made it difficult for jesters to develop a genuine sense of self, as they spent so much time performing that they often lost touch with their authentic personality and desires. This identity crisis was compounded by the fact that successful jesters often began their careers at a young age, meaning they never had the opportunity to fully develop as individuals outside their professional role. The result was often a deep sense of alienation from their own lives, as they struggled to distinguish between their performing self and their true self, assuming such a distinction still existed after years of constant performance. Family life was nearly impossible for most court jesters, as their unpredictable schedules, constant travel, and social isolation made it difficult to maintain meaningful relationships with spouses or children. Even those who managed to marry often found that their profession created strain in their relationships, as partners struggled to understand the demands of jester life, or grew tired of competing with their spouses' professional obligations for attention and affection. Children of jesters faced their own challenges, as they were often stigmatized by association with their parents' profession, and found it difficult to establish themselves in more respectable occupations. The dietary restrictions and eating habits imposed by their profession created additional health challenges for jesters, who were often expected to eat unusual or unappetizing foods as part of their performance, or to demonstrate their willingness to do anything for a laugh. Some jesters were required to maintain specific body weights or appearances that necessitated unhealthy eating patterns, while others found their meal times constantly interrupted by demands for impromptu performances. The irregular eating schedule and poor nutrition that resulted from these professional requirements took a toll on their physical health and energy levels, making it even more difficult to meet the demanding requirements of their job. The climate of violence and brutality that characterized much of medieval court life meant that jesters were constantly exposed to disturbing sights and experiences that would traumatize modern individuals. Yet they were expected to maintain their cheerful demeanor and continue entertaining even in the aftermath of executions, torture, or other violent spectacles. This exposure to routine violence and cruelty inevitably affected their mental health and worldview, creating a cynical and hardened perspective that made it difficult to find joy in life outside their professional obligations. The technological limitations of medieval times made even basic aspects of jester life more challenging than they would be today, as they lacked access to modern conveniences that could have made their profession more bearable. Simple things like reliable lighting for evening performances, weather-resistant costumes, or effective makeup and stage props were either unavailable or of poor quality, making it more difficult to create the spectacular effects that audiences expected. The lack of recording technology meant that jesters had to rely entirely on their memory to preserve their material, and a moment of forgetfulness during a performance could result in embarrassing mistakes that might damage their reputation. The seasonal depression that affected many people in medieval times was particularly challenging for jesters, who were expected to maintain their entertaining persona regardless of the weather or their personal mood. During the long, dark winters when everyone else was allowed to retreat into quiet contemplation or melancholy, jesters were still required to provide sunshine and laughter, forcing them to suppress their natural emotional responses to the changing seasons. This constant requirement to be on, regardless of circumstances, created additional psychological strain that compounded the other stresses of their profession. The lack of intellectual stimulation available to jesters outside their professional duties was another source of frustration and dissatisfaction, as many were intelligent individuals who craved meaningful conversation and intellectual challenge, but found themselves trapped in roles that required them to suppress their serious thoughts in favor of constant entertainment. The dumbing down of their public persona meant that they rarely had opportunities to engage in the kind of philosophical or political discussions that might have provided relief from the constant pressure to be amusing. The superstitions and folklore surrounding jesters in medieval culture often painted them as unlucky or somehow cursed, creating additional social stigma that made their already difficult lives even more challenging. Some people believed that jesters brought bad luck or were in league with dark forces, leading to ostracism and suspicion that extended beyond the court into their interactions with ordinary citizens. These superstitious beliefs made it even more difficult for jesters to find acceptance or belonging outside their professional roles. The primitive state of medieval medicine meant that the chronic injuries and health problems that resulted from their physically demanding profession often went untreated, or were treated with methods that sometimes made conditions worse rather than better. Jesters who suffered from the cumulative effects of years of physical performance had few options for relief and were expected to continue working despite pain and disability that would be considered grounds for retirement or disability compensation in modern times. The political upheavals that characterized medieval Europe created additional instability for court jesters, who might find themselves suddenly unemployed or even in danger if their patron fell from favor or was overthrown by rivals. Unlike other court positions that might be retained by new rulers, jesters were often seen as too closely associated with the previous regime to be trusted, leaving them vulnerable to persecution or exile whenever political winds shifted. This political volatility meant that even successful jesters lived with the constant knowledge that circumstances beyond their control could destroy their lives at any moment. The limited opportunities for professional development or career advancement available to jesters meant that most remained in essentially the same role throughout their entire careers, with little hope of moving up to more prestigious or secure positions. Unlike other medieval professions that offered apprenticeship systems or paths to master status, jester work was largely a dead-end job that offered few opportunities for growth or improvement in circumstances. This lack of career mobility contributed to feelings of hopelessness and frustration that made their already difficult lives even more unbearable. The psychological toll of constant performance extended far beyond the mere exhaustion of entertaining others, creating deep-seated mental health issues that medieval society had no framework to understand or address. Jesters were essentially required to live as perpetual actors, never allowed to drop their masks or express genuine emotions that might conflict with their professional persona. This emotional suppression led to a form of psychological fragmentation, where many jesters struggled to access their authentic feelings even in private moments, having spent so many years burying their true selves beneath layers of manufactured humor and artificial cheerfulness. The burden of being expected to lift others' spirits while receiving no emotional support themselves created a profound sense of isolation that went beyond mere loneliness. Jesters were often the ones called upon to comfort grieving nobles, distract worried rulers from their troubles, or provide levity during times of crisis. Yet when they themselves faced personal struggles or tragedies, there was no one to whom they could turn for similar comfort. This one-way emotional exchange drained them of their psychological resources while providing no means of replenishment, leading many to develop a hollow, empty feeling that no amount of laughter from their audiences could fill. The constant need to appear mentally agile and quick-witted placed enormous pressure on jesters to maintain their cognitive abilities at peak performance, even as age, stress, and fatigue began to take their toll. A jester whose wit began to slow, or whose memory started to fail, faced not just professional decline but complete social irrelevance, as their entire identity was built upon their mental acuity. The The fear of cognitive decline haunted many jesters throughout their careers, adding another layer of anxiety to their already stressed minds, and creating a vicious cycle where worry about mental performance actually hindered their ability to think clearly. The seasonal celebrations and festivals that punctuated the medieval calendar presented their own unique challenges for court jesters, who were expected to create special performances for each occasion, while somehow making them feel fresh and exciting despite having performed similar routines for years. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, and royal birthdays all required elaborate entertainment that went beyond their daily performances, demanding additional preparation time and creative energy that was often already stretched thin. The pressure to make each celebration memorable meant that jesters had to constantly reinvent themselves and their material, a process that became increasingly difficult as they aged and their creative wells began to run dry. The hierarchical nature of medieval society created a complex web of relationships that jesters had to navigate with extreme care, as they interacted with everyone from kitchen servants to foreign ambassadors, each requiring a different approach and level of deference. A jester who showed too much familiarity with high-ranking nobles might be seen as overstepping their bounds, while one who was too distant might be perceived as antisocial or difficult to work with. This constant calibration of behavior based on social rank was mentally exhausting and created a fragmented sense of self as jesters learned to be different people for different audiences. The lack of privacy that came with court life was particularly challenging for jesters, whose living quarters were often shared with other servants or located in areas where they could be easily summoned at any hour. This absence of personal space meant that jesters had virtually no opportunity to decompress or process their experiences away from the watchful eyes of others. The simple human need for solitude and quiet reflection was a luxury that most jesters could rarely afford, leading to a constant state of overstimulation and emotional overwhelm that affected their mental health and ability to cope with the demands of their profession. The dietary peculiarities required of their performances often extended beyond mere entertainment into genuine health hazards, as some jesters were expected to consume spoiled food, unusual combinations of ingredients, or even non-food items as part of their comedic routines. These dietary stunts could lead to serious digestive problems, nutritional deficiencies, and food poisoning that not only caused immediate suffering, but could have long-term health consequences. The expectation that they would risk their health for the sake of a laugh demonstrated the callous disregard with which their physical well-being was treated by those they served. The intellectual frustration experienced by many jesters was compounded by the fact that their position often allowed them to observe the inner workings of political power and witness the mistakes and foolishness of their supposed betters. Yet they were prohibited from offering genuine advice or criticism that might actually be helpful. This forced them to watch in silence as poor decisions were made and opportunities were missed, knowing that their insights were unwelcome and that speaking up could result in severe punishment. The combination of intelligence, observation, and enforced powerlessness created a unique form of psychological torture for jesters who genuinely cared about the welfare of their courts and countries. The religious tensions of medieval Europe placed jesters in particularly precarious positions during periods of theological conflict or reform, as their profession was already viewed with suspicion by many religious authorities. During times when the church was cracking down on secular entertainment, or when different religious factions were vying for power, jesters found themselves caught in the crossfire, unable to please all sides and constantly at risk of being accused of impiety or heresy. The need to navigate these religious minefields while continuing to entertain audiences that included clergy members with varying theological perspectives required a level of diplomatic skill that few possessed. The physical demands of jester performances took a cumulative toll on their bodies that became more apparent as they aged, with many developing chronic pain conditions from years of tumbling, contorting, and performing physical comedy. Arthritis, joint problems, and back injuries were common occupational hazards that were simply accepted as part of the job, with little understanding of how to prevent or treat them effectively. The expectation that jesters would continue performing despite pain and physical limitation meant that many worked through injuries that would have sidelined athletes or laborers, leading to permanent damage that affected their quality of life long after their careers ended. The seasonal nature of court entertainment meant that jesters often faced feast or famine cycles in their employment, with busy periods of intense performance followed by stretches of relative inactivity that could be just as stressful as overwork. During quiet periods, jesters might worry that they were being forgotten or that their services were no longer valued, while busy seasons could overwhelm them with more demands than they could reasonably meet. This unpredictable workload made it difficult to maintain any sense of routine or stability in their lives, contributing to chronic stress and anxiety about their professional future. The costume requirements of their profession created both practical and psychological burdens that affected jesters' daily lives in ways that extended far beyond mere clothing choices. The elaborate motley outfits that identified them as jesters were often uncomfortable, impractical, and expensive to maintain, requiring constant repairs and cleaning that consumed time and resources they could ill afford. More significantly, these distinctive costumes marked them as different from normal society, making it impossible for them to blend in or escape their professional identity, even during their rare moments of leisure. The acoustic challenges of performing in medieval halls and outdoor venues required jesters to project their voices and physical presence in ways that strained their vocal cords and energy reserves. The stone walls and high ceilings of castles created echo problems that made it difficult for audiences to understand spoken comedy, while outdoor performances had to compete with wind, weather, and ambient noise. These environmental factors meant that jesters had to work much harder to achieve the same comedic effects that would be effortless in modern venues, leading to vocal problems and physical exhaustion that accumulated over time. The political implications of their humor meant that jesters had to stay constantly informed about current events, court gossip, and international relations to avoid making jokes that might inadvertently reference sensitive topics or ongoing conflicts. This requirement to be politically aware while maintaining the facade of being merely foolish entertainers created a complex cognitive burden that required them to process and analyze information at a sophisticated level while pretending to be simple-minded. The mental gymnastics required to appear ignorant while being well-informed was exhausting and contributed to the psychological fragmentation that many jesters experienced. The lack of legal protections for jesters meant that they could be subject to physical punishment or abuse with little recourse, as their low social status made it unlikely that authorities would take their complaints seriously. Stories exist of jesters being beaten, imprisoned, or even executed for jokes that were misunderstood or taken out of context, creating an atmosphere of fear that pervaded the profession. The knowledge that a single misstep could result in severe consequences made every performance a high-stakes gamble, where the potential losses far outweighed any possible gains. The impact of their profession on their personal relationships extended beyond mere scheduling conflicts to fundamental questions about their identity and worth as human beings. Potential romantic partners might be attracted to their wit and charm, but repelled by their low social status and uncertain future, while others might be interested only in the novelty or prestige of being associated with a court entertainer. These shallow attractions and rejections made it difficult for jesters to form meaningful relationships based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect, leaving many to face their challenges alone. The technological limitations of medieval entertainment meant that jesters had to rely entirely on their personal skills and charisma to create memorable performances, with no amplification systems, special effects, or recorded music to enhance their acts. This placed enormous pressure on their individual abilities and made it difficult to maintain audience interest over long careers, as there were limited ways to evolve or improve their performances beyond their natural talents. The lack of technological assistance also meant that jesters who suffered injuries or age-related decline had few options for adapting their performances to accommodate their limitations. The international nature of medieval courts, with their frequent foreign visitors and diplomatic missions, required jesters to be culturally sensitive while still maintaining their entertainment value, a balance that was often impossible to achieve. Humor that delighted local audiences might offend visiting dignitaries from different cultural backgrounds, while attempts to be universally inoffensive often resulted in bland performances that failed to satisfy anyone. This cultural minefield made every performance with international audiences a potential diplomatic incident, adding political pressure to what was already a challenging professional situation. The seasonal depression and mood disorders that affected many medieval people were particularly problematic for jesters, who were expected to maintain their cheerful personas regardless of their mental state. During the dark winter months when everyone else was allowed to be somber and contemplative, jesters still had to provide sunshine and laughter, forcing them to fight against their natural emotional responses to seasonal changes. This constant battle against their own psychology took a toll on their mental health and made it even more difficult to cope with the other stresses of their profession. The competitive nature of court entertainment meant that jesters were constantly being compared to other performers, both current colleagues and legendary figures from the past, creating an atmosphere of insecurity and self-doubt that undermined their confidence and enjoyment of their work. The knowledge that they could be replaced at any moment by someone younger, funnier, or more politically astute created chronic anxiety that affected every aspect of their performance and personal life. This competition also prevented the formation of supportive professional relationships, as other entertainers were viewed as threats rather than potential allies. The religious obligations that were part of medieval court life required jesters to participate in lengthy church services and religious ceremonies, where their usual behavior would be inappropriate, forcing them to suppress their natural inclinations toward humor and irreverence for extended periods. These enforced periods of solemnity were particularly challenging for individuals whose entire identity was built around their ability to find humor in any situation, creating internal conflict between their professional persona and the religious requirements of their social position. The primitive state of medieval hygiene and sanitation made the close contact required for court entertainment particularly unpleasant, as jesters often had to perform in close proximity to unwashed audiences in poorly ventilated spaces. The combination of body odor, bad breath, and various diseases that characterized medieval gatherings created working conditions that were not only uncomfortable but potentially dangerous to their health. The expectation that they would continue performing regardless of these conditions demonstrated the low regard in which their comfort and well-being were held by their employers. The limited understanding of mental health in medieval times meant that the psychological disorders that developed as a result of the unique stresses of jester life were often attributed to moral failings or spiritual weaknesses, rather than occupational hazards requiring treatment or accommodation. Jesters who developed depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues were more likely to be criticized for their lack of dedication or professional spirit than to receive any form of help or understanding. This lack of recognition for the mental health implications of their profession left many jesters to struggle alone with conditions that modern psychology would recognize as predictable consequences of their working environment. The inheritance laws and social customs of medieval times made it virtually impossible for jesters to pass on any accumulated wealth or advantages to their children, as their low social status and irregular income made it difficult to acquire property or establish lasting financial security. Unlike merchants or craftsmen who could leave their businesses to their offspring, jesters had only their skills and reputation to bequeath, and these intangible assets were rarely sufficient to provide for their families after their deaths. This inability to improve their families' circumstances through their labors added another layer of frustration and hopelessness to their already challenging lives. The political instability that characterized much of the medieval period meant that jesters often found themselves entertaining rulers whose legitimacy was questionable, or whose hold on power was tenuous, creating additional risks for anyone associated with the court. When dynasties fell or territories changed hands, jesters were often viewed as symbols of the old regime and might be persecuted or exiled regardless of their actual political beliefs or involvement. This political vulnerability meant that even successful jesters lived with the constant knowledge that forces beyond their control could destroy their lives without warning. The lack of standardized training or apprenticeship programs for jesters meant that most learned their craft through trial and error, often making costly mistakes that could have been avoided with proper instruction. The absence of professional organizations or guilds left jesters without any collective bargaining power or mutual support systems, making them entirely dependent on their individual relationships with their patrons. This isolation prevented the development of professional standards or ethical guidelines that might have improved working conditions for all jesters. The physical comedy that was central to many jester performances required them to engage in potentially dangerous activities such as juggling sharp objects, performing acrobatics, or handling fire, often without proper safety equipment or training. The expectation that they would take these risks for the entertainment of others demonstrated the expendable nature of their position and the low value placed on their physical well-being. Accidents and injuries from these performances were common and were often treated as part of the show rather than serious incidents requiring medical attention. The dietary restrictions and food taboos that varied from court to court required jesters to be constantly aware of cultural and religious sensitivities around food, adding another layer of complexity to their already challenging profession. A jester who inadvertently violated dietary laws or cultural food customs might face serious consequences, yet they were often expected to incorporate food into their performances without being given clear guidance about what was acceptable. This created situations where they had to navigate complex cultural minefields while trying to maintain their entertainment value. The seasonal festivals and celebrations that provided some of the most lucrative opportunities for jesters also created intense pressure to create memorable performances that would justify the additional expense of their services. The failure to deliver exceptional entertainment during these high-profile events could damage a jester's reputation and future earning potential. Yet the heightened expectations and larger audiences made these performances more stressful and difficult than routine daily entertainment. The seasonal nature of these opportunities also meant that jesters had to make the most of limited chances to earn extra income. The international political tensions that frequently erupted into warfare during the medieval period created additional challenges for jesters who might find themselves entertaining hostile audiences or being asked to perform material that could be interpreted as propaganda. The requirement to remain neutral while still being entertaining was nearly impossible to achieve, and jesters often found themselves caught between competing political factions with conflicting expectations. The failure to satisfy all parties could result in serious consequences that extended far beyond mere professional disappointment. The primitive state of medieval communications meant that jesters who traveled with their patrons often found themselves cut off from news and information about their families and homes for extended periods, creating additional stress and worry about their personal lives. The inability to receive regular updates about loved ones or to communicate their own well-being created a sense of isolation that compounded the other challenges of their profession. This communication gap also made it difficult for jesters to maintain relationships or manage personal affairs that required ongoing attention. The limited opportunities for retirement or career transition meant that most jesters faced the grim prospect of working until they were physically unable to continue, with no provision for their care or support in their declining years. The skills that made them valuable as entertainers were rarely transferable to other occupations, and their low social status made it difficult to secure alternative employment even when they were still capable of working. This knowledge of an inevitable impoverished old age cast a shadow over even the most successful jester careers and contributed to chronic anxiety about the future. The superstitious beliefs surrounding entertainment and laughter in medieval culture sometimes cast jesters as dangerous or unholy figures who were trafficking with dark forces or corrupting moral values through their influence. These superstitions could lead to persecution or ostracism that extended far beyond professional criticism to genuine fear and hatred from segments of the population. The association with magic, trickery, or supernatural powers that some people attributed to skilled performers could transform admiration into suspicion and make jesters targets for religious zealots or fearful communities. The lack of workers' compensation or injury protection meant that jesters who were hurt in the course of their duties had no recourse for medical expenses or lost income, often facing financial ruin as well as physical suffering when accidents occurred. The dangerous nature of many performances, combined with the complete absence of safety nets, meant that a single serious injury could end both a jester's career and their ability to support themselves or their families. This risk of sudden catastrophe added another layer of anxiety to their already precarious existence. The cultural expectations around gender roles in medieval society created additional challenges for female jesters, who faced discrimination and harassment that their male counterparts did not have to endure, while also being held to different standards of behavior and appearance that could conflict with the requirements of effective entertainment. The intersection of gender bias with the already low social status of entertainers created a double burden that made success even more difficult to achieve and maintain. Female jesters also faced unique vulnerabilities to sexual harassment and assault that were rarely acknowledged or addressed by their employers. The primitive understanding of psychology and human behavior in medieval times meant that the personality disorders and mental health issues that could develop as a result of the unique stresses of jester life were often misunderstood or ignored, leaving affected individuals without proper treatment or support. The requirement to maintain an artificial personality for professional purposes could exacerbate underlying mental health conditions and make it difficult for jesters to seek help even when they recognized that something was wrong. The stigma surrounding mental illness in medieval culture added another barrier to getting appropriate care for the psychological toll of their profession. The psychological warfare that jesters were often unwittingly drawn into as tools of their patrons added another dimension of suffering to their already complex existence, for they frequently found themselves used as weapons in the subtle battles for power and influence that characterized medieval court life. A clever ruler might use their jester to deliver insults or criticisms that would be unacceptable coming from anyone else, hiding behind the supposed innocence of fool's privilege, while using their entertainer as a human shield against potential retaliation. The jester, caught in this dangerous game, bore the risk of making enemies among powerful nobles who understood perfectly well that they were being mocked, but could not respond directly without appearing to lack a sense of humor or proportion. The constant scrutiny under which jesters lived extended beyond their professional performances to encompass every aspect of their personal behavior, as courtiers and nobles watched them constantly for signs of disloyalty, subversion, or simply amusing personal quirks that might provide additional entertainment. This fishbowl existence made it impossible for jesters to have truly private moments or to express genuine emotions without fear that their reactions might be misinterpreted or used against them. Even their most mundane activities became potential sources of amusement for others, creating a dehumanizing atmosphere where their basic human dignity was constantly under assault. The burden of maintaining multiple personas simultaneously created an exhausting mental load that few other medieval professions required, as successful jesters needed to be astute political observers, skilled entertainers, diplomatic advisors, and harmless fools all at the same time. They had to demonstrate enough intelligence to craft sophisticated humor, while appearing simple enough to be non-threatening, show enough courage to speak uncomfortable truths, while maintaining enough subservience to avoid serious consequences, and display enough wisdom to offer valuable counsel, while preserving enough foolishness to maintain their protective status as mere entertainers. This constant juggling of contradictory roles created cognitive dissonance that took a severe psychological toll over time. The sexual exploitation that many jesters faced, particularly those who were young or physically attractive, represented another dark aspect of their profession that historical accounts often gloss over or ignore entirely. Their vulnerable position in the court hierarchy, combined with their reputation as individuals outside normal social conventions, made them targets for unwanted advances from nobles who viewed them as fair game for harassment or abuse. Male jesters were not immune from such treatment, as powerful courtiers of all genders sometimes saw them as amusing diversions to be used and discarded at will, with little recourse available to victims who dared to complain about their treatment. The religious conflicts that periodically swept through medieval Europe created additional dangers for jesters, whose profession required them to navigate carefully between competing religious authorities and their sometimes contradictory demands. During periods of religious persecution or reform, jesters might find themselves caught between secular and religious authorities, each demanding different types of performances or prohibiting certain kinds of content. The humor that pleased a worldly nobleman might offend a visiting bishop, while material that satisfied religious sensibilities might bore or annoy secular audiences, leaving jesters to walk an increasingly narrow tightrope between conflicting expectations. The dietary monotony and poor quality of food available to most court jesters reflected their low status in the household hierarchy, as they typically ate with the servants rather than at the high table, receiving whatever scraps and leftovers remained after the nobles and more important retainers had been fed. This poor nutrition, combined with the physical demands of their profession and the stress of their precarious position, often led to health problems that shortened their careers and their lives. The irony of entertaining well-fed nobles while personally suffering from malnutrition was not lost on many jesters, adding resentment to their list of daily struggles. The linguistic challenges faced by jesters who served multinational courts or traveled frequently between different regions added another layer of complexity to their already demanding profession, as they needed to master not only the formal language of their hosts, but also the colloquial expressions, cultural references, and subtle humor that would resonate with diverse audiences. A joke that killed in England might fall flat in France, and wordplay that seemed clever in one dialect could be incomprehensible or offensive in another, forcing jesters to maintain vast mental libraries of culturally appropriate material for different situations. The physical deformities that some jesters were expected to maintain or exaggerate for comedic effect created long-term health problems and social stigma that extended far beyond their professional lives, as audiences of the time found humor in physical abnormalities that modern society would recognize as disabilities deserving of compassion rather than mockery. Some jesters were chosen specifically for their unusual appearance, or were even subjected to procedures designed to enhance their comic potential, suffering permanent disfigurement in service of entertainment that would horrify contemporary audiences. The lack of legal recourse available to jesters when they were mistreated or abused by their patrons left them essentially defenseless against even the most egregious violations of their basic human rights, as the medieval legal system offered little protection to individuals in their ambiguous social position. Cases of jesters being beaten, tortured, or even killed by cruel masters were often dismissed as unfortunate accidents or justified punishments, with no investigation or consequences for the perpetrators who were protected by their noble status, and the assumption that jesters, as professional fools, had somehow brought their suffering upon themselves. The environmental hazards of medieval court life posed unique dangers for jesters, whose performances often required them to work in close proximity to open fires, dangerous animals, or unstable structures that could collapse without warning. The great halls where they entertained were poorly ventilated, filled with smoke from torches and fireplaces, and crowded with intoxicated nobles whose behavior could become unpredictable and violent as the evening progressed. Jesters learned to perform while constantly assessing their surroundings for potential escape routes or dangers, adding another layer of stress to their already challenging work environment. The seasonal unemployment that affected many court jesters during times of war, plague, or economic hardship left them without income or support precisely when they were most vulnerable, as their skills were considered non-essential during times of crisis, when courts focused on survival rather than entertainment. Unlike farmers, craftsmen, or soldiers whose services remained valuable during difficult times, jesters found themselves among the first to be dismissed when resources grew scarce, forced to fend for themselves in a hostile world with few marketable skills beyond their ability to amuse others. The primitive state of medieval dentistry and personal hygiene created particular challenges for jesters, whose profession required them to speak clearly, sing melodiously, and maintain at least a minimally appealing appearance despite having limited access to dental care or bathing facilities. The loss of teeth, common among medieval people but devastating for entertainers who depended on their ability to speak clearly, could end a jester's career prematurely, while skin conditions, body odor, and other hygiene-related problems could make them so unpleasant to be around that audiences would refuse to tolerate their presence regardless of their comedic talents. The emotional labor required of jesters extended far beyond their official duties, to include providing comfort, counsel, and companionship to lonely or troubled nobles, who viewed them as confidants despite maintaining the pretense that they were merely entertainers. This unofficial counseling role required jesters to be skilled listeners, amateur psychologists, and emotional repositories for the fears and frustrations of people who could not show vulnerability to their equals, but felt safe expressing their true feelings to someone they considered beneath them in status. The burden of carrying others' emotional pain, while being unable to share their own struggles, created an additional source of psychological stress. The competitive pressure to constantly innovate and surprise audiences, who grew bored, easily forced jesters to take increasingly dangerous risks with their performances, attempting ever more elaborate stunts, daring political commentary, or shocking behavior in their desperate attempts to remain relevant and entertaining. This escalating arms race of outrageous behavior often led jesters into situations that compromised their safety, their reputation, or their relationships with important patrons who might initially encourage their boldness, only to turn against them when their antics went too far or attracted unwanted attention. The social isolation experienced by traveling jesters who spent their careers moving from court to court was particularly acute, as they never had the opportunity to develop lasting relationships or establish roots in any particular community, leaving them perpetually on the outside, looking in at the stable family and social networks that provided comfort and security to others. This nomadic lifestyle, while offering some variety and the possibility of escaping bad situations, also meant that jesters died alone and forgotten, with no family or community to mourn their passing or preserve their memory. the intellectual frustration felt by educated jesters who possessed genuine wisdom and insight, but were forced to express themselves only through humor and foolery, represented a particularly cruel form of mental torture, as they watched less intelligent courtiers receive respect and serious consideration for ideas that were inferior to thoughts they were only allowed to express as jokes. The knowledge that their intelligence was both their greatest asset and their most dangerous liability created a constant internal conflict between their desire for intellectual recognition and their need for professional survival. The physical pain that became a constant companion for aging jesters who had spent decades throwing themselves around stone floors, contorting their bodies into unnatural positions, and enduring the accumulating damage of countless pratfalls and stunts, made their later careers exercises in endurance that would challenge even the most dedicated performers. The lack of effective pain management in medieval times meant that these entertainers often worked through agony that would sideline modern performers, driven by the knowledge that showing weakness or inability to perform would likely result in immediate dismissal and destitution. The moral compromises that successful jesters were forced to make in order to maintain their positions often included participating in or facilitating cruel jokes at the expense of vulnerable individuals, remaining silent in the face of injustice when speaking out might cost them their livelihoods, and generally becoming complicit in systems of oppression that they might personally have found abhorrent. The weight of these ethical violations accumulated over time, creating guilt and self-loathing that poisoned their relationships with themselves and made it difficult to find meaning or satisfaction in their professional accomplishments. The technological limitations of medieval entertainment meant that jesters had to create wonder and amazement using only the most basic props and techniques, relying entirely on their personal skill and charisma to captivate audiences that had very limited exposure to sophisticated forms of entertainment. This placed enormous pressure on individual performers to be exceptional in every aspect of their craft, as they could not rely on special effects, elaborate costumes, or technological assistance to mask deficiencies in their abilities or enhance their natural talents. The seasonal depression and mental health challenges that affected many medieval people were particularly difficult for jesters to manage, as their professional obligations required them to maintain an upbeat and entertaining demeanor regardless of their internal emotional state, forcing them to suppress natural responses to the changing seasons, personal losses, or the general hardships of medieval life. This constant requirement to perform happiness while experiencing genuine sadness or despair created a psychological disconnect that could lead to serious mental health problems that went unrecognized and untreated in an era that had little understanding of such conditions. The financial exploitation that many jesters experienced at the hands of unscrupulous patrons who delayed payments, reduced promised compensation, or simply refused to pay for services rendered left them with little recourse beyond accepting whatever scraps their employers chose to provide, as the medieval legal system offered minimal protection for service providers who lacked significant social status or political connections. This economic vulnerability meant that even successful jesters often lived in poverty despite their apparent proximity to wealth and power. The cultural stigma associated with their profession extended to their families and descendants, who often found themselves marked by association with entertainment and foolery in ways that limited their own opportunities for advancement or acceptance in respectable society, creating a generational cycle of marginalization that could persist long after the original jester had died. Children of jesters faced discrimination in marriage, employment, and social relationships that reflected broader societal attitudes about the inherent dignity and worth of different types of work. The physical deterioration that resulted from years of demanding performance took many forms beyond the obvious injuries from falls and stunts, including vocal damage from constant singing and speaking, hand and finger problems from juggling and musical instrument playing, and back and joint issues from the repetitive motions required for dance and acrobatic performances. These occupational hazards accumulated over time to create chronic pain and disability that made it increasingly difficult for aging jesters to meet the physical demands of their profession. The emotional exhaustion that came from constantly monitoring the moods and reactions of their audiences, adjusting their performances in real time to maintain engagement and avoid offense, created a mental fatigue that extended far beyond the normal tiredness associated with physical work, as jesters had to remain perpetually alert to subtle social cues and power dynamics that could shift without warning and dramatically affect their safety and security. The lack of institutional support or professional organizations meant that jesters had no collective bargaining power, no standardized working conditions, and no mechanism for sharing knowledge or supporting colleagues who faced difficulties, leaving each performer to navigate the challenges of their profession in isolation, while competing against others in similar situations for the limited opportunities available in their field. The artistic limitations imposed by the need to please unsophisticated audiences who preferred crude humor and simple entertainment over more refined or challenging forms of artistic expression frustrated many jesters who possessed genuine creative talent, but were forced to suppress their artistic ambitions in favor of lowest common denominator material that would guarantee laughs and applause from their immediate audience. The constant travel required by their profession exposed jesters to all the dangers and discomforts of medieval transportation, from muddy roads that could trap vehicles for hours to bandits who preyed on travelers, while also subjecting them to the additional risks associated with being recognizable performers who might be targeted by criminals who assumed they carried valuables, or by political enemies of their patrons who saw them as convenient targets for indirect revenge. The social expectations placed on jesters to be perpetually available and entertaining meant that they could never truly relax or enjoy normal human experiences like quiet contemplation, serious conversation, or simple companionship, without the performance element that defined their professional identity, creating a profound sense of alienation from their own humanity that could persist even in private moments when no audience was present to entertain. The medical ignorance of the time meant that many of the physical and mental health problems that jesters developed as a result of their profession were misunderstood, mistreated, or simply ignored by medical practitioners who lacked the knowledge to provide effective treatment, leaving performers to suffer through conditions that modern medicine could easily address while continuing to meet the demanding requirements of their jobs. The political vulnerability of their position became particularly acute during times of succession crisis or regime change, when jesters who had served previous rulers might find themselves viewed with suspicion by new power structures that questioned their loyalty or saw them as potential sources of information about their predecessors, forcing them to navigate dangerous political transitions while maintaining their entertaining personas and avoiding actions that might be interpreted as taking sides in conflicts beyond their control. The dietary restrictions and food quality issues that affected most medieval people were particularly problematic for jesters, whose profession required them to maintain high energy levels and physical performance capabilities despite often having access only to poor quality nutrition that could not adequately support the demands of their physically intensive work, leading to malnutrition-related health problems that further compromised their ability to perform their duties effectively. The lack of privacy that characterized jester life extended beyond their professional performances to encompass their living arrangements, personal relationships, and private activities, as they were often housed in shared quarters with little opportunity for solitude or personal space, making it difficult to maintain psychological health or develop the internal resources necessary to cope with the constant stresses of their demanding profession. The seasonal nature of much medieval court entertainment meant that jesters often faced periods of reduced income or unemployment during certain times of the year when their patrons were occupied with other activities such as military campaigns, religious observances, or agricultural responsibilities, forcing them to find alternative sources of income or survive on savings during these lean periods, while maintaining their readiness to resume full-time entertainment duties when court life resumed its normal rhythm. The primitive state of medieval communication meant that traveling jesters had difficulty maintaining contact with family, friends, or professional contacts when they were away from home, creating a sense of disconnection and isolation that could persist for months at a time during extended tour or residencies at distant courts, while also making it difficult to coordinate future employment opportunities or respond to emergencies that might arise in their absence. The lack of standardized working conditions or employment protections meant that jesters had to negotiate individual arrangements with each patron, often finding themselves at a significant disadvantage in these discussions due to their limited bargaining power and the oversupply of individuals seeking entertainment positions, resulting in agreements that frequently favored employers at the expense of performer welfare and security. The cultural association between jesters and madness or mental instability created additional stigma that could follow performers throughout their lives, as people often assumed that anyone willing to make a living through foolery must be somehow mentally deficient or emotionally unstable, leading to discrimination and prejudice that extended beyond their professional activities into their personal relationships and social interactions. The physical demands of maintaining elaborate costumes and props without access to modern cleaning methods or materials meant that jesters often worked in uncomfortable, unhygienic conditions that could contribute to skin problems, respiratory issues, and other health concerns, while the cost of maintaining and replacing worn-out equipment often consumed a significant portion of their limited income, leaving less money available for basic necessities like food, shelter, and medical care. The emotional toll of constantly witnessing and participating in the casual cruelty that characterized much of medieval court entertainment, from the mockery of disabled individuals to the celebration of violence and suffering, created psychological trauma that could persist long after specific incidents had ended, as jesters were forced to become complicit in systems of oppression and dehumanization that violated their basic sense of human decency and compassion. The intellectual isolation experienced by educated jesters who possessed knowledge, wisdom, or artistic sensibilities that exceeded those of their audiences created a profound sense of loneliness and frustration, as they were surrounded by people who valued them only for their ability to provide crude entertainment, while remaining completely indifferent to their more sophisticated thoughts, ideas, or creative capabilities. The lack of legal protections against workplace harassment, abuse, or exploitation meant that jesters who experienced mistreatment from patrons, fellow courtiers, or other employees had virtually no recourse beyond enduring the situation or seeking employment elsewhere, often under circumstances that made it difficult to find alternative positions due to damaged reputations or negative references from former employers who resented any suggestion that they had behaved inappropriately. The constant pressure to maintain peak performance levels despite aging, illness, injury, or personal problems created a relentless stress that could accelerate physical and mental deterioration, as jesters who showed any signs of declining ability faced immediate threats to their employment security and had few options for transitioning to less demanding roles or reducing their performance obligations without losing their livelihoods entirely. The social ostracism that often extended to retired or former jesters made it difficult for them to establish new identities or find acceptance in conventional society after leaving their entertainment careers, as people continued to view them primarily through the lens of their former profession and had difficulty taking them seriously as individuals capable of contributing to society in other capacities, leaving many former performers isolated and marginalized for the remainder of their lives. The gradual physical deterioration that marked the final stages of a jester's career was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their profession, as their bodies slowly betrayed the very skills that had defined their identity and provided their livelihood, forcing them to watch helplessly as their ability to tumble, dance, juggle, and perform the elaborate physical comedy that audiences demanded gradually slipped away like sand through their fingers. The arthritis that settled into joints worn down by decades of abuse, the failing eyesight that made juggling dangerous, the shortness of breath that left them gasping after performances that had once been effortless, and the trembling hands that could no longer manage delicate manipulations, all served as daily reminders that their time was running out, and that the skills which had sustained them were inevitably fading. The financial desperation of aging jesters who had been unable to save money for retirement due to their precarious income, and the constant demands of maintaining their professional equipment and appearance, often drove them to increasingly desperate measures to extend their careers, accepting performances that were beneath their dignity or beyond their capabilities, working for patrons who treated them with contempt or abuse, and compromising their health and safety in pursuit of whatever income they could generate before their abilities failed completely. The knowledge that each performance might be their last created a desperate urgency that poisoned whatever joy they might have once found in their craft. The loss of memory and cognitive function that affected many aging jesters, whether due to head injuries sustained during years of physical performance or simply the natural deterioration associated with advanced age, was particularly devastating for performers whose livelihood depended on their ability to remember vast repertoires of jokes, songs, stories, and routines, while also maintaining the quick wit and mental agility that allowed them to improvise and respond to unexpected situations during their performances. The cruel irony of losing their mental faculties just when they most needed them to compensate for their declining physical abilities added another layer of tragedy to their already difficult circumstances. The social abandonment experienced by jesters who could no longer perform effectively reflected the harsh realities of medieval society, where individuals were valued primarily for their utility and contributions, rather than their inherent worth as human beings, leaving former entertainers to face old age and death without the support networks that sustained others who had built families, communities, or professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than mere entertainment value. The loneliness of their final years was often profound, as they realized that the laughter they had generated throughout their careers had created no lasting bonds or genuine affection. The medical neglect that characterized the treatment of aging and infirm jesters reflected their low status in the social hierarchy and the limited resources available for healthcare in medieval times, but it also demonstrated the callous indifference with which society treated individuals who had outlived their usefulness, leaving former performers to suffer through painful conditions and debilitating illnesses, without access to even the basic comfort measures that might have eased their final days. The knowledge that they had spent their lives bringing joy to others only to be abandoned in their time of greatest need must have filled their last years with bitterness and regret. The spiritual crisis that many aging jesters faced as they contemplated their mortality often involved wrestling with questions about whether their lives had been wasted in frivolous pursuits, while more serious and meaningful occupations went unfulfilled, wondering whether the laughter they had generated had any lasting value or significance beyond the momentary pleasure it provided, and struggling to find peace with choices that had seemed necessary for survival, but which, in retrospect, might have led them away from more fulfilling paths that could have provided greater dignity and purpose. The lack of institutional memory or historical recognition that characterized the jester profession meant that even the most talented and accomplished performers faced the prospect of dying in complete obscurity, with their skills, experiences, and contributions forgotten almost immediately after their death, as their art was inherently ephemeral and their social status too low to warrant the kind of documentation and commemoration that preserved the legacies of nobles, clergy, and other important figures. The knowledge that their entire life's work would vanish without trace must have been profoundly disheartening for individuals who had dedicated themselves to their craft. The economic exploitation that continued even in their final years often involved unscrupulous individuals who took advantage of aging jesters' desperation and vulnerability to extract whatever value remained from their declining abilities, offering them minimal compensation for appearances that traded on nostalgia or morbid curiosity rather than genuine entertainment value, while providing no real security or support for their basic needs as they approached the end of their lives. These final humiliations added insult to injury for performers who had already sacrificed their health, dignity, and social standing in service of their profession. The physical pain that dominated the final years of many jesters' lives, resulting from the accumulated damage of decades of demanding performance, often went untreated or was inadequately managed due to the primitive state of medieval medicine and the low priority given to the comfort of individuals who were no longer economically productive, leaving former performers to endure chronic suffering that made their remaining days a trial of endurance rather than a time of rest and reflection after a lifetime of service. The family relationships that many jesters had sacrificed or neglected during their careers could not be easily restored in their final years, as the social stigma associated with their profession, their frequent absences during their working lives, and the financial instability that had characterized their careers often left them estranged from relatives who might otherwise have provided support and comfort during their declining years, forcing them to face death as they had lived much of their lives. Alone and dependent on the uncertain charity of strangers, the housing insecurity that affected many aging jesters reflected their lifelong dependence on patrons and employers who had no obligation to provide for their welfare once they could no longer perform effectively, leaving former entertainers to search for shelter and care among people who viewed them as burdensome reminders of mortality, rather than individuals deserving of respect and assistance, often ending their days in whatever poor accommodations they could find or afford with their limited resources. The lost opportunities and unfulfilled dreams that haunted the final years of many jesters included relationships they had never been able to pursue due to the demands and stigma of their profession, creative projects they had never been able to attempt because their time and energy were consumed by the need to generate immediate entertainment for others, and personal growth and development that had been stunted by the requirement to maintain a specific persona and set of behaviors that served their professional needs, but prevented them from exploring other aspects of their personality and potential. The recognition that their profession had been built on the systematic dehumanization of themselves and others, as they reflected on the cruel humor they had been required to perform and participate in throughout their careers, often created profound guilt and shame that poisoned their final years with regret and self-recrimination. As they came to understand the true cost of the entertainment they had provided and the damage it had inflicted not only on their victims, but on their own moral and spiritual development. The gradual loss of the skills and abilities that had defined their identity throughout their adult lives created an existential crisis for aging jesters who struggled to understand who they were beyond their role as entertainers, having spent so many years suppressing their authentic selves in favor of their professional personas, that they could no longer distinguish between their true personality and the character they had performed for decades, leaving them to face their final years without a clear sense of their own identity or worth. The poverty that characterized the end of life for most jesters reflected the fundamental economic insecurity of their profession and the absence of any social safety net for individuals who had devoted their lives to what society considered non-essential services, forcing them to spend their final years worrying about basic survival needs rather than focusing on the spiritual and emotional preparation that death ideally requires, while also depriving them of the dignity and comfort that should accompany the end of any human life. The awareness that their suffering and decline might themselves become sources of cruel entertainment for those who had once applauded their performances added a final layer of humiliation to the experiences of aging jesters, as they realized that their former audiences might view their current struggles with the same callous amusement they had once directed toward other victims of misfortune, transforming their personal tragedy into one last involuntary performance for the entertainment of others who saw their pain as just another form of comedy. Thus, the life of a medieval court jester, from its promising beginnings through its gradual deterioration to its inevitable tragic end, represented one of history's most poignant examples of human exploitation disguised as entertainment, a profession that consumed the lives, health, dignity, and humanity of those who practiced it, while providing nothing more substantial in return than the fleeting pleasure of momentary laughter and the hollow satisfaction of having amused people who viewed them as objects rather than fellow human beings deserving of respect, compassion, and basic human dignity. The bells that once announced their arrival with such festive cheer ultimately became the funeral dirge for lives sacrificed on the altar of others' amusement, their jingling sound a melancholy reminder of the price paid by those who chose, or were forced by circumstances, to make others laugh at the cost of their own happiness, health, and hope for a better life.